Thank you for coming tonight. This is the end of a 5-year passion project for me in putting this story together. And as Kirby mentioned, I discovered Murray with this article when my father passed away, and he was really into genealogy, Irish genealogy, and he was attempting to find our Irish roots. So there was this article that talked about his prominence in the West, talked about him having the second wealthiest man in Montana, W.A. Clark being the first. And as Kirby mentioned, he liked practical jokes, which seemed like an intriguing combination. Very wealthy and also had a sense of humor. But I have to dispel the notion of the practical jokes. As it turns out, Murray's idea of a practical joke was cheating people. So for example, this gentleman would be on the outskirts of town with a wagon with a load of planks of wood like this. Murray would pay the gentleman some money. He would count the planks in the load. The man would then be directed to park outside of a saloon. Murray would then engage the patrons of the saloon in a friendly wager on how many planks would be in this load. Of course, Mr. Murray always won. Now, he called these cinches, and this was a pattern in his life. And I'll just read a quick excerpt from David Emmons' foreword in the book, because I think he captures this very well. Murray was also a consummate cheater. And as this terrific book makes clear, he cheated at everything. Random bets, cards, banking, and the buying and selling of mines, and every other kind of property that he added to his remarkable portfolio. He cheated strangers, he cheated friends, cheated his family. Given the time and place, Jim Murray must have been either the luckiest or the toughest or the most disarmingly charming man in the room. As Farley biography makes clear, he was a lot of all three. And that's a good description of the individual that I found. Consummate cheat in the very rough, the wilderness of Montana, but also extremely charming. Now, just in terms of the research and trying to track down Murray's life, this map indicates where I conducted my research. So the red dots indicate where I went to find archive material about his ownership in mines. So there was down in San Diego, Monterey, California, Nevada, up and down the Pacific coast, a lot of time in Montana, at Butte, Missoula, Livingston, Helena, and then in Washington, D.C., I looked at the archives for the national intelligence agencies, because during World War II, Murray was involved in a lot of seditious activities. So I covered a lot of ground. The green dots represent where I presented portions of his life at academic conferences, Irish American Studies conferences. The gold dots in Montana, Missoula, and down in San Diego, those areas represents where there were papers of Murray's, where there was actual communications with partners. So in Missoula, he had a partner, Sandbar Brown, who donated his papers. So there was a lot of correspondence to Murray. In San Diego, his partner was Ed Fletcher, and Ed Fletcher managed his water project in San Diego, where Murray built the largest dam in San Diego and had control of a large segment of the water production for that area. And in those papers, there's actually correspondence from Murray back and forth between the different partners. And the blue dots represent the location of the journals where I published pieces of his life. The Journal of San Diego History, Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and then a trade magazine, Wild West Magazine. Now, after all that research, this is kind of the footprint that I saw of Murray's career. So he had a big presence in Montana. In Montana, he had properties in Helena, Butte, Deer Lodge, Livingston. This is really where he built his fortune before the railroads took off and he started expanding his network. In Seattle, he had properties downtown, Central Business District. He also had properties in Tacoma. Down in San Diego, he had the water company and thousands of acres of real estate. And then in Monterey, California, this is where he had his palatial estate that he bought late in life in 1905 when he was about 65 years old. He also did a lot of donations, philanthropic work in Monterey. And then in New York, this is where he went to spend his money. And he made quite a splash in New York City. he was known as one of the more flamboyant hinterland millionaires that would come into town and show and demonstrate their excessive wealth. When I forgot Pocatello. Pocatello, he had the waterworks, newspapers, banks, and a theater. So, and then those gold dots were kind of the minor places. So like in New Mexico, this is where he secretly divorced his first wife. Louisiana is where he bought his first thoroughbred racing horse. Wisconsin, he personally went and bought folding chairs for the first theater in Butte. And in Utah, he owned several properties. So he was kind of scattered all over the country, which made him difficult to kind of piece together. Now, the reason why you haven't heard of Murray, you haven't heard extensively about him, there's three reasons. The first is he was extremely secretive. These are the only 4 pictures that I found of Murray in all of my research. So when he was 50 years old, 60, 70, and 80. He was superstitious about having his name on things. His good friend John McGuire put his name on a theater, and he had him take it off. One of his partner in San Diego, named a lake after him, and he said, we got to take that off. We should name it after the community. The community would take great pride on it. And the reason he didn't want to have his name associated with it, he felt there was one time in his life where he did that. He got full of himself, he said, and he lost a lot of money. So he was superstitious about being too full of himself, that was just going to bring him bad luck. So he did not like to leave a record. The other reason we don't see a lot of Murray is he didn't leave a grand mansion behind. So in Butte, you've got W.A. Clark's grand mansion. You've got his son, Charlie Clark's chateau, which Murray eventually acquired. But then Murray at Copper and Main had his bank. It still there exists today. He lived in an apartment above the bank. So not a very elaborate housing arrangement in Butte. He did spend a lot of time at his resorts. He had several resorts. But there's no mansion in Butte to signify that he had great wealth. Now, where he did have a mansion was in Monterey, California. And so the picture on the top is his mansion. It covered about 1,000 feet of undulating coastline. So it starts on the far left with the main quarters, and then ends here on the far right with the horses' stables. In between, there's a greenhouse. There was a bowling alley that he converted to an art gallery. But this house no longer exists. There's postcards below. During that time, around 1900, 1905, we had a big postcard boom. So you could buy 3 postcards of Murray's mansion if you were in Monterey. Now, the reason it no longer exists is sardines. So there was a big boom in sardines. The red box indicates where Cannery Row is located in Monterey, California. This was made famous by John Steinbeck's novel. So when the boom occurred, canneries expanded all the way over to Murray's mansion, which is in yellow. And there was actually canneries on the other side of Murray's estate for a short time. This was in the 1940s after he had passed, and his stepson had inherited the house. So the sardines wiped out his house. And today, this is the footprint of his house. There's a small plaque in the middle of this yellow box that has a picture of it, but hardly anybody walks by or sees that plaque. So today there's a 4-star resort on part of his property on the right-hand side. There's a hotel on the far left-hand side, and there's still some of the abandoned canneries in the middle. In California, there's a coastal commission, so it's extremely difficult to develop oceanfront property. So we've got his superstition, we've got sardines, and the last piece was extortion. Murray was nobody's hometown hero. He made a lot of money extorting money out of local governments. So for example, in Butte, when Butte was going through its boom, as telephone wiring and electricity needed copper and the boom was occurring in Butte, and people were developing mines, Murray made claims inside the city boundaries where the city was going to grow. So he had the 2 claims in the red area, the Arctic claim and the smokehouse claim. And this head frame here is the smokehouse claim. So Murray staked out these claims, and anybody that wanted to build on top of his claim had to get permission from him, because he had the right to destroy those properties to access his property. So rather than really mining this, I think this is just a prop that he put up. So rather than mining it, he leased his property to business owners. So he was reportedly gaining $500,000 a year from leases. The city had to lease the roads from him in order to provide access to and from the areas. So this is just one example. In Livingston, he owned the waterworks. In Pocatello, he had the waterworks. In San Diego, he had the waterworks. And you know, if you control the water, you have the ability to really manipulate local government, extort money from local governments. So nobody was going to build Murray a statue, no local government. So again, back to the footprint, I just want to cover a couple of the assets, the properties that he had, looking kind of focusing in on the Northwest. In Pocatello, I mentioned he had the water company, the newspapers, theater, the banks. In Livingston, he had Hunter's Hot Springs, banks, the water companies, Helena. He had a theater, I think, he had a resort. He had the Broadwater and the Boulder Hot Springs near here. Mentioned Seattle and Tacoma. He had office properties and banks. The resorts, Hunter's Hot Springs on the top, that was out by Livingston. So that was something that he really was fond of. He added a tennis courts, a golf course, and he brought the architecture from Monterey, the kind of the mission style, to Hunter Hot Springs. You know, you look at the outline, the architecture, and you look at the Carmel mission, it's very, very similar. He did the same with Boulder Hot Springs, where he brought that architecture. And then he acquired Broadwater Hotel and Natatorium kind of late in life after it had gone through some difficult times. So he had these resorts. And then in Seattle, just to kind of show example of his holdings there, this is Seattle today. In 1905, the city looked like this. It was just starting to have its first skyscrapers. In fact, Murray built one of the very first concrete framed, steel frame reinforced high-rises in Seattle. He had properties throughout the central business districts. The green dots represents his holdings. And there was one story when the federal government was looking to locate a large building. Everybody was scrambling to have property next to the federal building because they thought that was going to be a big spur development. And the rumors were that Murray was kind of guiding the process, which, you know, was fair to think that he was trying to cheat and gain an advantage. But it turned out he had properties throughout the central business district. So wherever that building landed, he was going to benefit. And all these properties ended up being profitable for him. Two of the buildings exist today. On the far left, that building still exists. He didn't develop that building. He leased the ground to somebody else on a 99-year ground lease. Same deal with this property over here. He leased it on a long-term ground lease. In the middle, that's his bank that he built. That's the only property that's no longer standing. So he's very active in the Seattle business market. Now let's go to, in terms of kind of organizing just for this presentation, I just want to feature his circle of friends. And I kind of grouped them in 4 categories: sidekicks, copper kings, family, and the Irish radicals. And I'm going to spend some time on the Irish radicals. But the sidekicks up top, so first of all is Fat Jack. Fat Jack was a carriage driver in Butte. He was also complicit with Murray in some of his cinches. One of the stories is that Fat Jack would come into a community on stagecoach, and he was very tall, 6'3", very Lincoln-esque, so people noticed when he walked into town. He would go into the general store, stand on a scale. Town people would kind of notice because they all were waiting for the stagecoach to come in, so they were there, and he would step on the scale. And they would all see how much this tall, unusual character weighed. They didn't know that he was wearing a lead belt around his coat. So then he would go to the hotel. Murray was there observing all this, and he would make the comment, "I bet that gentleman doesn't weigh more than 120 pounds. All the townspeople saw the scale, and he weighed 140 pounds. So Murray engages in a friendly wager with everybody. They bring back Fat Jack to stand on the scale to verify how much he weighs. But of course, Fat Jack has taken the lead belt, put it under his bed, and what do you know? He weighs exactly what James Murray predicted. So Fat Jack was one of the characters that was complicit in these cinches. When the railroads came into Butte and a new business opened up where you had to have carriages ferry people from the railroad stations to the center of town, because before you had the stagecoaches would drop you right out in the middle of town. Fat Jack thought this would be a good business. So Murray lent him money for his carriage. And later, when automobiles came in, he also lent him money for a taxi cab. Fat Jack had a gambling problem, so occasionally he would run into trouble and not have enough money for his gambling habits. So one time, he came to Murray, asked for a loan for some gambling, and the only collateral he had were his false teeth. So Murray lent him some money in the false teeth. Fat Jack lost his bet. So for a few days, as he was trying to earn off his money, he didn't have his false teeth. And the story goes that he came to James Murray at one time and said, "Can I just borrow them for lunch?" And Murray's reply was, "If you must eat, you can have soup." So there was an association between these two from the early days of the 1870s all the way to when Fat Jack died around 1910. Another sidekick was Sandbar Brown. He got his nickname Sandbar because he murdered somebody on a sandbar. And he was a trapper. He located in Phillipsburg, where he operated some of Murray's mines. He also handled some of the dirty work where Murray needed to bail out a friend or a prostitute or somebody. Sandbar would be kind of the front person to manage that transaction. And then John McGuire. John McGuire was probably his closest friend. McGuire came from Ireland. As a young boy, he remembers seeing the caravans in town with the performers, and he wanted to be an actor. So he came to America wanting to pursue that career. He started in San Francisco. He didn't make the cut. He went to Nevada. He didn't make the cut. He kept on getting cut from troops. Some say it was because it was real thick Irish brogue. But he decided, well, he wanted to stay in the industry, so he became a manager. So he managed some properties in Nevada and San Francisco, and then he decided he was going to set out to Montana to try to do acting again as a single performer. So he circled the West in the 1870s, and he would have crossed paths with Murray's at that time. And he eventually settled in Butte, and he came to Murray with an idea to build an opera house in Butte. And so Murray and him collaborated. Murray provided the financing. McGuire had with him E.S. Paxson as his set designer. So the three of them worked together to build the first theater in Butte. E.S. Paxson did all the interior paintings and the scenery. In fact, went back to New York to train with some of the folks on scenery, on set design. Murray went to Wisconsin to get the chairs, and McGuire went to New York to book the performers. So they worked together as a team. When they had the first performance, the person that got the most reviews or raves was E.S. Paxson for his work. It wasn't a large turnout for the first play. They didn't were able to get the best performance, but people really raved about Paxson's work. And he worked in the basement of the theater. McGuire had an apartment in the opera house. They had a kind of a torch. The theater business was difficult in terms of as the railroad came and there was better access for groups to come into Montana. The Eastern Syndicate started to control the groups. So McGuire's life was pretty tortured in trying to keep the acts and the performers continue to come to Butte. But Murray stood behind him the entire time. Paid him a salary, which was very unusual for Murray. He didn't pay people salary who were losing money all the time, but McGuire, he did. Now the Copper Kings, Augustus Hines on the top, W.A. Clark in the middle, and Marcus Daly at the bottom. Now this is a pair where there was a lot of tension between these three, particularly between Clark and Daly. Murray had a fine relationship with all of them. His relationship with Hines started out a little rough. Hines leased a mine from Murray initially when he came to town, and he cheated Murray. He was supposed to pay Murray a royalty for the ore that he collected if it reached a certain quality. But what Hines did is he mixed in the copper ore with rubble to drop the grade to where he didn't have to pay for any royalties to Murray. Now Murray found out, sued him, and lost. Now Murray wasn't upset. Maybe he was upset a little bit, but he gained a lot of respect for Hines. He thought, this is the kind of person that I want to partner with. So Murray established a partnership with Hines in the future. So they worked together. And he also, politically, he was aligned with W.A. Clark. He was a member of the Central Committee for the Democratic Party. There was a lot of communication between Clark and Murray on politics, and they also were partners in mines. And finally, Daly is an Irishman. Before Daley hit his big strike, Murray and him had a couple of mines and partnerships together. When Daley died, Murray was part of his estate and still had ownerships with Daley. So Murray was able to kind of work through the conflicts that all the other folks had and work with everybody. And then family. Murray didn't have a large organization. He ran everything by himself, but with family members being kind of the key parts. So his first wife, Sally Burchett, was divorced. She was one of the original settlers in Montana. B.B. Burchett was her father. He was the first mining camp judge to sentence somebody to be hung. And she was tough. They met in Pioneer, Montana. And Murray hid a lot of assets under her name as well as her brother's name. But eventually he divorced her in New Mexico, eventually told her and gave her some mining interest and sent her on her way. Then he married Mary Murray, a second wife. Mary Murray didn't have as much of a role in the business, but she became kind of the force to move him to Monterey, and eventually kind of created some tension between the family in Butte, Montana, and the family in Monterey. And then finally, James E. Murray. James E. Murray, along with his siblings, May Murray and Marcus Murray, came to Montana after their father passed away. So the mother and the siblings all came out to Montana to work for James A. Murray. And so Murray put them to work. Marcus and May Murray went to Washington to work. Sometimes they were assigned to work in Utah. James E. Murray stayed in Butte, and Uncle Murray sent him to law school at New York University. That's where he gained some connections with Tammany Hall. I'm not sure that he gave the tuition to James E. Murray. He talked about financing his education. So I think James E. Murray came back to Butte with some debt that he had to pay off to his uncle. But while he was in New York, he dined at the finest restaurants. He had open tabs, and he would dine with Lillian Russell and Diamond Jack Brady and some of the celebrities of the day. And then the Irish radicals. So Jeremiah Lynch on the top, Lawrence Dugan, and Robert Dunn. Lawrence Dugan was a socialist undertaker, which makes me giggle a little bit. So he was a radical. He was also famous for the term for a rock that might be hanging in a mine that might kill you. They called that a Dugan, since he was the undertaker. So if you ever heard the term Dugan in terms of mining, it came from him. So I'm going to spend some time on this last group. In the book, I try to give you a sense of all these different characters, and what Murray really provides is a cross-section of culture and class, which is unusual for someone of this wealth. He is in the saloons, he is witnessing shootouts, he's loaning money to miners. He's loaning $50, and he's loaning $26,000 to Charlie Clark. So he is loaning money to people across the spectrum. So it really gives you a kind of good snapshot of the Wild West in Montana. So on the radicals, Murray was a member of the Ancient Order Hibernians, which at the time was kind of a diplomatic group that was trying to advance Ireland's freedom through negotiations and building relationships. The other group, more radical group, was the Clan de Gael. The Clan de Gael's mission was to overthrow the British Empire, the British rule in Ireland through physical violence. So there wasn't any millionaires, wealthy individuals that were members of this radical organization. Daley was a member of the Ancient Order Hibernians. He was invited to join the Clan de Gael, which operated under the name of the Robert Emmet Literary Association in Butte. But he declined, but Murray was a member. So that's one example of Murray's kind of radical Irish leanings. Another example, when Robert Purnell was in Ireland, was having some financial difficulty, there was an effort to raise money for his living expenses. And the Irish National League was set up in the United States to send money to him. Now, Pope Leo was discouraging clergy in Ireland from assisting in this effort. So in Butte, they set up a chapter to send money to Purnell. And that was their mission, was just to raise money for Purnell. But Murray took the leadership of the resolution, the committee. So he chaired the committee that was going to write the resolution that would go along with the money. So he didn't just stop at we recognize that you need money and we're going to help you with these living expenses. He took a shot at Pope Leo. So he's in his resolution, he speaks directly to Pope Leo. We emphatically repudiate Pope Leo's claim to exercise any authority over us as Irishmen, while we vindicate the solemn and sacred duty we owe our mother country. Very strident language. And I don't think he ever forgave Pope Leo. Later on in life, he named one of his racehorses Pope Leo, which I don't think was a term of endearment. And then another kind of example of his Irish radicalism, and this is a little bit circuitous, but very close to his home in Monterey, California, there was the location of the first Mass in North California. So Junipero Serra, who developed a string of missions in North America, was headquartered in Monterey, California. And the very location of the first Mass was in Monterey. So at the time, and this was just a half a mile from Murray's house, it was marked by a simple wooden cross. And Murray thought that should be, there should be a better monument for that. And at the time, the California Historical Commission was buying up sites like this to put in monuments. So they did buy the site where Junipero Serra had the first Mass. But nobody had the money to build the monument. Now, Murray was fascinated with this site. The painting from Leon Trousset over here is a painting that Murray acquired just about the time he was going to build this monument. And he had it kind of brought to brought to Monterey. It was in his art collection, later donated to the Carmel Mission where it resides today. But he really, this was a very important site to him. So he gained control of the ability to build the monument. And as we know from the kind of debates about monuments in the Civil War, who builds the monument is the one who defines what history is. So Murray decided to define the location with a Celtic cross. So this is Murray's marker for Junipero Serra's location. There is a portrait of Junipero Serra in the middle of the cross, and then there's the Carmel Mission here at the base. Both of those features were developed or designed by a very famous sculptor, Douglas Tilden, from the Bay Area, who did a lot of the sculptures in San Francisco. So he got to control it. Now, why did he use a Celtic cross? Here's a picture of the monument in place. It was on property owned by the federal government, so I'm sure he enjoyed seeing the military guard his cross. Down there in the red circle is the old wooden cross, and then far in the distance is a monument to Serra that Leland Stanford's wife had constructed. And just to verify that there are no other Celtic crosses associated with Junipero Serra, here are all the other monuments to Junipero Serra throughout the region, and none of them have a Celtic cross. Now, why did he use a Celtic cross? So here's my theory. The Celtic cross was not always a symbol of Irish nationalism. Around 1905, the advocates for freedom in Ireland were using seals, postage seals, to raise money. So like Easter seals where you'd buy them and then you'd put them on your letters as kind of a symbol of support for that cause. There was a Celtic cross and a harp that were being sold as these seals that could be put on letters. And they were statements of Irish nationalism and pursuing freedom. So here is the seal that came out just about the time, just before Murray commissioned his cross. So my theory is that Murray was making a statement. He was using the Celtic cross as just kind of a statement of Irish nationalism, along with commemorating a very important site. Now I fast forward to another example. We'll go into World War I. So where we've got the troops occupying Butte to make sure copper production is continuing to provide the basic materials for our allies in the fight against Germany. But in Dublin, you've got the Easter Rising, where Ireland is trying to take advantage of England's distraction with World War I, and they're trying to extricate English troops from Ireland. There were two thoughts. The Irish community was split on this. Some wanted to side with England, figuring that maybe England will do them a favor if they side with England in the war, and others wanted to side with Germany. Murray was on the side with Germany, so he donated to the German relief causes. He was on the extreme side that wanted to see a German victory. After the war, and there was extreme labor strife, there was a newspaper that popped up in Butte called the Butte Bulletin. And this was kind of a response to the tremendous pressure on labor unions to suppress wages and to continue working. So Butte, the Butte Bulletin was funded by Murray, the expansion. And they were a very radical paper. Their headline here is that we preach the class struggle in the interest of the workers as a class. Now, I use this example because there's a little humor in this one. Typically, the headline would be, labor strike tomorrow, something along those lines. This one recognized that the Cincinnati Reds won the World Series. But they had a little humor. Baseball classic is captured by Pat Moran's Bolsheviki. So the Cincinnati Reds kind of referred to them as the Bolsheviki. Now the paper, in terms of the Murray's investment, the research prior to my article all kind of indicated that Murray funded the initial start of the paper when it was a weekly, and that the paper then drifted away into this socialist communist leaning that Murray had no control over. But in reality, I found the actual funding of Murray to the paper, and it came exactly at the time that it went from a weekly to a daily. And this was against the orders of the governor, who was trying to ban all conversion, all daily newspapers starting up because of the paper shortage. So Murray gave his loan for $12,500 for a larger printed press so that this paper could go become a daily and become the largest paper in Montana. And it didn't just circulate to Montana. These papers were distributed to timber camps in Spokane and throughout the West. So it really became a voice for the Wobblies, the IWW, and all the groups who were trying to organize labor throughout the Northwest. Now the paper has been kind of represented as a labor paper only, promoting labor and somewhat socialism. But I did a word count of this paper in 3 different areas: labor, socialism, and Ireland. And what I found was in all 3 areas it had more content, more concentration of content in those 3 areas than any other paper in Montana or really in the country. So it was equally an Irish nationalist paper, a socialist paper, and a labor paper. It covered everything. And here are 3 cartoons that kind of illustrate the content in the paper. On the far left, it focuses on being a representative of the labor, indicating that all other papers are really representing capitalist and business interest. In the middle, you've got labor, the hands of capitalism squeezing every drop of blood out of a worker. But then on the right, you have Ireland with a whip, whipping the English tiger. So it had all 3 elements. Another example of this, when James A. Murray's nephew, became active in Irish politics and kind of was carrying the torch for the Murray family on Irish nationalism. When he gave a presentation to raise money, the newspaper covered his speech along with Judge Jeremiah Lynch, and they said, Irish must be made free, such is the purport of a masterly address by Honorable James E. Murray and Judge Jeremiah Lynch. So you would see this very slanted, biased coverage that was pro-Ireland throughout the paper and throughout the years that it operated. Now this paper really became a platform for James E. Murray, James A. Murray's nephew, to rise in the ranks of the Irish national community. He first became a representative of Montana's organization supporting Éamon de Valera, and on the left there is James A. Murray. Here's James A. Murray, Éamon de Valera, and then Judge Jeremiah Lynch, together during Éamon de Valera's visits to Butte to raise money. So Murray started as a representative of Montana, but then became a vice president of this de Valera's association, and eventually became president of a 60,000 member organization that was raising money for the extrication of England. James A. Murray, and my belief is James A. Murray funded James E. Murray's efforts in this regard, because James E. Murray had a large family. He could not have been spending all this time without income. So Murray did transfer a lot of properties into James E. Murray's name, a lot of income properties. So what I suspect is all this income property that went to James E. Murray was able to give him, afford his living expenses while he was pursuing this Irish nationalist agenda. And I think that served as a really good platform for him later on when he pursued his senatorial career here. So here's kind of the rapids. So we've got the Copper Kings, the sidekicks, the families, and the Irish radicals. The way I've organized the book, I've got it in 3 parts. So part 1 is chronological, where he's building his wealth. So from 1840 to 1909. Then, and this is chronological order. And I would say it was a struggle with a subject like Murray, who has so many activities going across the country. When the railroads came in, he was constantly riding the rails. It seemed like he never slept. So you would find him day by day moving from city to city. So I tried to make this first part chronological on how he built his wealth. The second part, I kind of stop and step back and say, here's how he spent his money. And here's how that compared with other tycoons of the day. And then in the third part, I cover the end game, so kind of how things wrapped up in his life, his business interest, and then I go into the battle over his estate. And at the very end of the book, I've got 3 obituaries. So these were kind of the Murray being the key character, but the supporting cast is Fat Jack and John McGuire. And I provide the obituaries for those individuals from those contemporary papers. And I think those are good to read after you've gone through the book, because you can see how those obituaries of the day treated people's lives versus reality that I've tried to present. I've tried to present all the good and the bad of these individuals, all the ups and the downs. I'm not the best publicist for James A. Murray. You know, I tried to find the redeeming qualities in James A. Murray. He was a very great friend to John McGuire. He was a great friend to Ireland, but he cheated a lot of people. And as you'll read, he cheated some people, drove them to suicide. So he had a very tough business edge. He did have a great sense of humor. He was the life of the party in New York. And he did great things for Ireland and his friends, but he definitely had a dark side to him. But you'll see in the obituaries how kind of people try to romanticize individuals' lives. If I wanted to romanticize his life, I really could have just focused on Monterey, because that's where, with his monument, he contributed the renovation of the Carmel Mission. He provided some financial support to the artist colony. He did a lot of things that if you just kind of glossed over how he made his money, you could say that he was a good friend and he did a lot of great things, philanthropical in the Monterey area. So that's kind of the overview of his life. Now I can take questions that you have about Murray.
Did he die in 1921?
Yes, he died in 1921 in Monterey at his estate. And John McGuire also died in Monterey. And Murray did a really fantastic monument to McGuire in the Monterey Cemetery, which was only about 1.5 miles from his house.
Did he have children?
No children. Murray's first wife had a child. His second wife had a child. He had no children. In his will,